the boundaries as you weigh it with the fetal right to life. So one of my concerns from the outset was I wondered what the Supreme Court would do with the woman's right to control her body, because I definitely believe there is a right, as do most people. But the right that was created in Roe was not an absolute right. It was a right that was limited by the state and by the state's interest in potential fetal life. So the woman never had an absolute right in this area. And now the matter just goes back to the state. So when the Democrats say that Dobbs has destroyed and eliminated the woman's right, it's not exactly correct. They prevented the federal government, the federal court, from determining what that right is and its parameters. They put back to the states and their legislatures the power to determine its bounds and metes. Now, one of the questions about Dobbs now is, what will its impact be for the future? A couple of things. The debate between fetal rights and the woman's right to an abortion is certainly not over. It will be as intense, if not more intense than ever, and it will be fought in the state legislatures. So the importance of the book I wrote, The Fetal Right to Life Argument, which you can get on my website, cpaulsmith.com, that is just as important as ever. And it can help people as they address this issue. The other concern that many have about Dobbs is that this will lead to the overturn of the Lawrence and Obergefell cases. Lawrence, I think, was 2004 or 5, I forget. And Lawrence case said that there is a fundamental liberty of people to engage in private consensual sex, whether it's heterosexual or homosexual. That was that right. And then Obergefell, which I think was 2015, the Supreme Court said that same-sex marriage should be allowed in every state. So there is concern that these two cases are now in jeopardy. And I would have to say rightly so, because some of the same principles that required Roe to be overturned were used wrongly by the Supreme Court in Lawrence and Obergefell. So Justice Thomas encourages the court to revisit those cases, as well as the Griswold case, which was the right of a married couple to have contraception. But the Supreme Court majority opinion says no. Anyone who thinks that this opinion is signaling any intent to review these cases is wrong, even though Justice Thomas says, I wish they would. But the majority opinion says no, that we are not intending to do that. They said what was present in Roe, which was so egregious and which was just totally steamrolled over by the court, was the right of a fetus to continue living, or as the court called it, the right of the state to protect potential human life. And the court says because of these very serious and important rights that Roe just trampled upon, it was necessary to review and eventually overturn Roe. They said these circumstances do not apply to either Lawrence or Obergefell. So I presume that means they're not about to review those cases. But I would say, how about this? In terms of the future, what about transgender rights, which are a big issue right now? And I would say this, it is clear to me from what the court is saying in Dobbs, that the court would leave this determination to the states as well. And I think they would object and oppose to the Supreme Court's entering into the fray and establishing transgender rights. And that is a big issue. I just saw on TV yesterday, someone had a definition of what male and female is, and what was being taught in a third grade class, I think, as I remember on TV, was someone who says that that people are either male or female. They are wrong, because there's male or females, but then there's all these other options. I object to that teaching. That is pandering to a very narrow and small group of people who have issues and concerns. And it is an instrument that will hurt my children and my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren from preparing to have happy and fulfilling lives. People who begin to challenge their own gender and deny that there's any divine role in what you're born with, but that just based on some subjective feeling, you should go ahead and try to change. I am concerned about that, and there may be weird cases where it might require some unusual dealings, but for 99.9% of the human race, encouraging people to challenge their biological gender, I think, will cause serious and lasting problems. And so I don't want the Supreme Court to get a weird majority of activists in there to resolve that question. Now, let me turn back again to Justice Roberts' concurring opinion. Again, his decision, his opinion here was very significant. Now, remember, this opinion was released a couple of months before an early draft was released, which has never happened before. So one of my questions has always been, how is Justice Roberts going to rule on this case? Where is he going to go? And I wondered whether he would join with the majority, because I figured they would indeed overturn Roe. So it turns out he tried to split hairs and declined to go with the 5 justices who wanted to overturn Roe. Instead, he says, look, I believe the viability rule should be discarded, but I wouldn't overturn Roe. Historically, I think Roberts is going to be seen as a weakling, because once you destroy the viability standard that was being used to say when you could begin to protect fetal right, basically you totally destroyed Roe. And there was nothing at that point, if you're going to say viability isn't the right standard, there was no reason to hang on to Roe. So I think the history is going to show him as a soft and a weakling. One other matter that needs to be discussed is the current effort in Congress to codify Roe. And in this regard, now it's the end of July 2022, the House has passed Bill H.R. 3755, which would codify Roe in that it would enact a law that protects a woman's right to have an abortion up to the time of viability. But the Senate has not yet passed that, and whether they will, we don't know. The thinking is they would not be able to get by the filibuster rules, and so they wouldn't be able to enact that. But even if the Senate did pass such a law, the question is, would the Supreme Court uphold the law? And I don't think they would, because Congress would be, in essence, trying to override the rights of the state to legislate in the areas of abortion and fetal rights. And the very essence of the Dobbs decision is that is a matter of states and personal rights, that the federal government doesn't have the right to do that. One case that I believe would be used to support this determination is the Morrison, United States versus Morrison case from the year 2000, when the Supreme Court struck down the Violence Against Women Act. Now, nobody on the court supports violence against women, but the Supreme Court said this was legislating by the federal government in an area that would belong to the states, and they said it was not proper. And for that reason, not because they disagreed with the goals of the Violence Against Women Act, they just struck it down. And I think the same would happen if this law ever were to pass through Congress. Of the early release of the Dobbs decision, about 2 or 3 months before it actually officially came out, there's no evidence that any of the justices changed their votes. They may have, I don't know. whatever, it did not prevent the court from overturning Roe, even though the early release of that opinion did incite some protests and a lot of Democratic angst. The Supreme Court apparently was not intimidated by this and did what they were planning to do. So in summary, the Dobbs case, again, which will be one of the most important cases in the history of this nation, I believe, for a long time. What it did is it restored democratic principles to our nation. It rebuked the court from being a super legislator that can pronounce laws about new rights, which both give new rights and extinguish others. This court reprimanded the court for that. And it returns to the people to determine the bounds of rights, especially rights in competing situations, such as in the abortion case, where you have a woman's right to control her body pitted against the right of the unborn child within her. So Roe was an egregious case. Dobbs corrected it. So the debate will continue. People will continue to demonize the court and criticize them for that. In my opinion, the Supreme Court at this point in time has never been better in its views, more correct in its views of the Constitution in my lifetime. And I'm grateful for the Dobbs case. So that will conclude our discussion for today. Thank you for joining us. Remember that the liberties we enjoy in America can be maintained only when its citizens are moral and informed participants in the democratic processes. The closing argument can help all of us to make this happen. See you next time. This is Paul Smith.